let's take a look at the box office from this past weekend. Total take for the weekend of $99 million, so a 2.5% jump from the previous weekend. So basically held out pretty steady from last weekend. Technically really 4 films opening up now in the top 10 for this week. At number 1, we have If, the John Krasinski kind of family comedy about imaginary friends or whatever. Brought in only about $35 million, which, again, all of this is always relative, right? Because if a $35 million box office return or opening weekend for a film that cost $2 million to make, that's incredible. But this was projected to make anywhere from 38 to 44, so this definitely fell below my projections, at least, right? And again, this was off of a $110 million budget. So again, it's not like that example of where it will only cost like a ham sandwich to make, right? And it's made about $59 million worldwide, so it's made a little bit more than that 35, getting closer to that $110 million budget mark, but it still has a long way to go. And I don't think I've seen a single enthusiastically positive review for this film. So it'll be interesting to see if families and children latch onto this. Because if not, this is gonna, again, the summer season's just gonna get so crowded, this is just gonna plummet. Especially, even discounting the crowded summer film release season, there's just gonna be a lot of family films coming out. I know in a little less than a month, we're gonna get Inside Out 2. Right? So, and I'm sure there's going to be plenty more that I'm just blanking on now. But yeah, I am foreseeing with my magic powers, I'm foreseeing that this is not going to do very well in weekend number 2. Also opening this week at number 3, The Strangers Chapter 1, bringing in about $12 million. So by contrast, this actually exceeded my projections a little bit. I thought it would make around $9 to $11 million. So a little bit more, and it was only off of an $8.5 million budget, right? So it has exceeded that budget, but of course, as we all know, if you've been watching my streams, you know very well, you usually need to make about double your budget to account for marketing and advertising costs that aren't included in that budgetary number. But that's the appeal of making a cheap horror film, is that usually there's usually a baseline amount that it's gonna make. And if you can keep it cheap enough, then it's gonna be a profitable venture no matter what. Also opening this week at number 6, can't even make the top 5. Back to Black, only brought in about $2.9 million for the weekend. Talk about underperforming, because I projected this around $6 to $10 million, and I thought I was being too harsh on it. But it couldn't even hit the bottom of that range, right? Which is surprising. I think it has a lot to do with the negative reviews surrounding the film, and it hasn't been where in contrast, something like the Bob Marley biopic that came out in February, that, in terms of the marketing, that was everywhere, right? That was just everywhere. Whereas this, I feel like I only saw a trailer for this a few times, and I go to movies fairly frequently, right? So the fact that I only saw the trailer maybe 3 or 4 times, that's a really low amount if I'm going all the time, right? And the reviews didn't help. Right, that it just it didn't seem to be a particularly good biopic, because biopics, as we saw with Bob Marley and then in previous years, music biopics do really well financially. So this is definitely going to be disappointing for these filmmakers. It's made a total, though, because I think it's been out in England for some time now. This brings its total worldwide box office to about $39 million. So again, not awful, but again, this is disappointing in terms of an American theatrical release. Also opening this week at number 9, The Blue Angels, a documentary about American military fighter pilots. I didn't go see it. I don't plan on going to see it. Brought in about $1.3 million, so it just barely squeaked into the top 10 there, which is interesting to see a documentary up there. In terms of stuff continuing this week, we have at number 2, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, bringing in about $26 million for the weekend. So it dropped from first to second place in its second frame. This was a 56% drop, which I don't remember what I had said, if I thought it was going to have a big drop or not. I remember remarking in my last week, talking about when this film first opened, that it was interesting to see how well it did, since it's not like a franchise you think of as being like this huge moneymaker, right? And I think because this movie isn't like that original trilogy of this reboot really kind of had momentum built up over time, whereas this one, while it's technically like the next installment, it takes place like hundreds of years after. So it's essentially a new story in this universe. So I thought it was pretty good. I was gonna write a review for it, but I'm thinking I'm gonna be too busy the next couple of weeks between my friends getting married and then my fiance Viviana, who's watching, hello, is graduating. So we're going to travel for her, in-person graduation. I just had a bachelor party last week, so I'm not gonna be able to review this, but I thought it was quite good. Not great by any means, but definitely on par with I think the other films in this rebooted chapter of this franchise. But it is a little disappointing to see that a drop as big as 56%. That's not the end of the world, but it's obviously not. You want it to maybe be at least under 50, I would say, before alarm bells kind of start going off, right? So this brings its total domestic box office return to now 101 million, so that's pretty good, and 238 million worldwide, off of just a $160 million budget. So it's, it still has a bit of a way to go to double that number, because what would that be, 320 million? But that's a pretty impressive, 2-week return so far, especially in this post-COVID era of Hollywood, right? Looking at some other stuff in the top 5 here, number 4, we have The Fall Guy, still staying in the top 5, but I am predicting it's going to drop out of the top 5 by next weekend, if not the next weekend. Bringing about 8.5 million for this weekend, dropped from 2nd to 4th place in its 3rd frame. So this was a 38% drop. If you remember from the past couple of weeks, this was a little bit disappointing open, and then also a disappointing, I think, 2nd weekend drop. Which is a shame, because I thought it was it wasn't great, but I thought it was a fun, and I thought it wasn't a great film, but it was a great kickoff, I think, to the summer movie season. So far, it's brought in about 63 million domestically, 128 million worldwide. So those are not awful numbers. It becomes concerning when you consider it was made for about 125 to 150 million, right? So it still is a long way to go to just break even, which again is a shame. And I also like Bullet Train, David Leitch's previous film before The Fall Guy. Also in the top 5 here, we have Challengers sticking in at 2.9 million for the weekend. It dropped from 3rd to 5th place in its 4th weekend. This was a 33% drop. And again, this is a film that is not going to be like a huge blockbuster, but I remember there being like a lot of hype for on like film Twitter, right? So I remember in its 2nd weekend when it had a pretty disappointing drop, being surprised, but I also have to remember like film Twitter is not America, right? Like people have different interests and different movie going patterns. So this brings its total domestic return to about 44 million and its worldwide return to 79 million. Which again is impressive considering it's a mid-budget film, made for about $55 million, and it's essentially a high concept film, right? So if you don't know, or rather it's a low concept film. If you don't know what those terms mean, basically it's not anything to do with the quality, but if something's low concept versus high concept is something where it's like you read the log line and it's like very, it grabs your attention, right? So like that's most mainstream big budget blockbuster Hollywood films, right? So like Star Wars, Spider-Man, things like that, where there's something interesting about it, just literally reading like a 1 to 2 sentence kind of explanation of what the film even is. By contrast, low concept films are films that are on paper pretty simple and straightforward, but are of quality due to the execution, right? Like a director's vision or performances. So like a good example, so like a good example of a low concept film would be like Moonlight, right? Where on paper it's like, okay, it's a interpersonal drama about race in America, right? And sexuality, right? Like that's not something where you go like, that's really creative and interesting. What makes it a phenomenal film is the execution, is the direction, is the performances, is the writing, the cinematography, things like that, right? So it's all of this to say is that Challengers is more or less a low concept film, but due to just how well made it is, it's doing as well as it is, and hopefully it can keep some momentum. Just one more kind of note here. Still in the top 10. I like to plug, if something's been in the top 10 for more, like in its fifth weekend onward, I like to give it a little plug here. So the only thing like that would be Godzilla x Kong, The New Empire at number 8, bringing in just a humble $1.7 million. Dropped, though, had a pretty big drop in the sense of placement in the top 10. Dropped from 5th to 8th in its 8th frame, though. So it's been out for basically 2 months. And this was only a 35% drop. And this brings its domestic total to 194 million and its worldwide total to 561 million, all off of a roughly 135, 150 million dollar budget. So it's definitely broken even. This has been a very big success for Warner Brothers, and I think it's like one of the most successful films of the year so far. But we obviously still have a long way to go when it comes to that. Looking at some comments here, Viviana says, the only marketing I saw for Back to Black are the cutouts at the movies. I don't think I've ever seen a trailer. I wonder if it's for movie/production reasons or if Gen Z doesn't really know Amy. Like, is there more of a lack of funds or a lack of interest? That's a really good question. I think I never even thought of it like that. Yeah, I think there might be something to the idea that Amy Winehouse, as we know, like tragically died in, I think it was 2011. Part of the, the unfortunately part of the 27 Club, right? So I think there is still a cultural fascination with her because her music was so great and she was taken from us so soon. That has, through osmosis, still carried down to, I think, like the Gen Z generation, right? I think it definitely helps that, and this is like going to be really silly when I say it, but it's like, like everything helps. I think Glee did, not an Amy Winehouse episode, but like, I think someone did Back to Black, like Santana, right? Naya Rivera. And Glee is huge for Gen Z and even like Gen Alpha, like watching it on Netflix, like people who didn't watch it when it was airing, right? So that definitely, I think, helps, right? But that's a really good point. Maybe it's just a lack of, ultimately it has been 13 years since she passed away. So who knows? Viviana also writes, oh no, Kung Fu Panda 4 has finally been thwarted and pushed out of the top 10. Justice for Poe. Yeah. I don't really care. I didn't see the film. I heard it was fine. But that is another film that is, like Godzilla x Kong, was in the top 10 for a really long time. I think longer. I think it came out before Godzilla. That was in the top 10 for at least 9 or 10 weeks. And yeah, it's also, I think, one of the most successful films of the year so far in terms of domestic and international box office returns. But, it'll be interesting to see how, again, we're really starting to get into the summer season now. So it's going to be interesting to see what films kind of end up being still the highest grossing, right? Because we might feel like the bar is at a certain level and then it might get completely shattered later in the year. But who's to say? I'm really curious to see what ends up being like in the top 10 for the year.